Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my short series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women who are doing incredible work around the world. My name is Emily Prey and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. And today I'm speaking with Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network. And I have to tell you that you are my first repeat guest, so thank you for coming on the show, but also welcome back to Gendering Geopolitics.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for having me back.
Of course. So last time we talked about Afghanistan. Today we'll be discussing the protests in Iran. A few weeks ago, a young woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police for not properly covering her hair, and she later died in their custody, which sparked protests across the country and across the world. So on a personal level, how does it feel to be an Iranian woman right now?
This is it's kind of generational trauma coming out in the sense that if I wanted to go back 100 years, I would say that in my grandmother's time, Reza Shah took the hijab off and forced sort of non-hijab, the hijab became illegal. In my mother's generation, when the revolution happened, when the revolution happened, that then was taken over by the Islamist forces that are currently in power, they imposed the mandatory hijab, and my mom was out protesting in 1979. And then in my own generation, I went back to Iran for the first time. I left at the age of 11, and I went back at the age of 18. And I remember arriving there, and I had to be covered in black, and only my face could show. Everything had to be wide, and just you were just shrouded. You only your face could show, and I didn't know how to put the scarf on, and it was very scary because you could be anybody could comment and tell you that you weren't properly covered. And in the years that I went back, I constantly saw women resisting and pushing it back and shortening the coats and stuff. And now it's my children's generation. It's my kids' generation, and younger than my kids. They're high school girls now that are protesting. And so it really feels kind of existential. I think it's really about the future and the idea of simple dignity and hope that is, on the one hand, tied to the scarf, but actually the scarf is also the tip of the iceberg, because it's also the discrimination is embedded in the constitution, which is Sharia and the way that they interpret Sharia in Iran.
And there's been a lot of videos of women and girls, and as you mentioned, high school girls burning their hijabs, cutting off their hair. What is the relevance of hijab for regime identity in Iran?
So, they call themselves the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? What is Islamic about them? The very entity of the Vali Faqih, the supreme leader, was a kind of a theoretical concept that they put in place. It's kind of a made up structure, right? We don't have Islamic banking. It's not like we have Sharia banking and economies and things like that. It's really about the social control, and then that social control has been about male supremacy and female co-option and coercion and control and second class citizenry, in a way, if you want, for women. And as I say, it's in the legal frameworks around age of marriage and your rights, that whether you're recognized as a witness in as an equal person in the court of law or in any kind of formal setting. But then the hijab, the covering of women, and that control over what we look like in public, is that constant reminder that this is about that gendered discrimination is embedded in the very essence of the state and the state's identity.
Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has called the protest riots designed by the US and Israel to destabilize the country, and has claimed that sanctions are being used to foment the protests. But what, in your opinion, what is the real impact of sanctions on Iran?
So first of all, the idea that it's Israel and the United States is completely absurd. It is school kids and it's now school boys as well. And the only thing that is fomenting it is the fact that not only they killed Mahsa Amini, they now killed many others as well. 17-year-old girl was killed and brutalized, and so that part of it is absolutely absurd. And in terms of the sanctions, the regime has always tried to sort of convey this idea that, the West puts these sanctions to get people out on the streets and protest. What I've seen in the years that I've went back and forth to Iran was that actually the sanctions shut down those that were trying to sustain independent businesses, private sector businesses, and spaces where people could be employed gainfully. And the state, in a way, became the only space for employment. And the state has a myriad different security forces in it. You've got different ministries. You've got the Revolutionary Guard. You've got the Basij. It's a tangled web. And what I think has happened is that as people have not been able to find jobs, especially young men, with the pressure that a patriarchal society puts on them to provide income, those jobs have come in the space of the state, and in a way in the security apparatus of the state. And so the bread on the table is tied to the baton in their hands, and the sanctions have actually strengthened the regime's hardest and most extreme elements, as opposed to undermining them. So the narrative from Iran or from Khamenei is completely false. The sanctions have enabled them, not disabled them.
A really important point as we're, trying to understand what's going on and what the future holds for these protests. Mm-hmm. So what do you think is the trajectory of these protests and the future of women in Iran right now?
That is the gazillion-dollar question that everybody is asking. I think that as Iranians who have seen, I was a child when the revolution happened. People came out in the streets against the Shah. It was a unified force that came out against. But then when the Shah left, the question was, what are we for? And the most ruthless and the most organized entity, which were the Islamists, won. Then we had the Iran-Iraq war. So my generation has understood that you don't want to just be against something, that what violence and war actually means. But as the new generations come in, number one, this has, they don't remember those days. And number two, their demands for basic freedom, for basic life, for dignity, these are existential issues. And so from the stand of the protesters, this is deeply existential. And I would say, one of the issues is that over the years, in these 43 years that women have resisted, and this, it's been almost like a silent game of saying, okay, we'll push it back an inch here and shorten it there. We will maintain it, or people will, they've maintained or created kind of inner lives of young people living together, and it's a very modern, progressive existence, actually, in the private sphere of life in Iran. But to have a young girl killed and to have the regime come back and try and assert these morality laws or that they didn't have since the 1980s, it's really pushed people to the edge. And so for them, it's existential. What's the direction that we're going? For the state, also, this is a real moment because it is a profound crisis of legitimacy. When you have your children protesting, are you going to go kill the kids? Are you going to arrest high school children? They arrested a singer. They arrested a football star. They even have from the clerical establishments, people are coming out and actually saying, we need to question the doctrine and the statements and the orders that are coming from the supreme leader. So there's a crisis of legitimacy that's happening there. That said, it's not organized. The protests are, it's not it's leaderless, which makes it that much more powerful. And the real question for me is, are we going to see security forces putting down their weapons and not killing the kids and not attacking them? They're attacking the most prominent universities in the country. Are they going to stop that? Right? Are we going to see the clerical establishment step up? What's going to happen from within the political establishment on the one hand? And then in the meantime, we have to be careful about outside forces and regional forces, because the best thing that can happen for Israel and for Saudi Arabia, for Israel and Saudi Arabia, is that Iran goes down on its knees like Iraq and Syria and Libya and becomes dysfunctional, because that allows the Israelis to do what they want with the Palestinians without having a regional force in play. And it allows the Saudis to continue their spread of Wahhabism, which is what they've been doing. Whereas if Iran emerges and can be a democratic state of some sort in that region, it would still be a voice in support of injustice done to Palestinians. It would still probably be a voice that would push back against extremist Wahhabism. So that there are forces that absolutely want the country to be on its knees. There are forces inside that want to squash, but they're now facing a crisis of legitimacy. And then you have this young generation that just wants to breathe and live, and that's the side that we want to be on.
There's a lot of geopolitical complexities here, and it is really incredible to see all of the work that women on the ground have been doing, but also young people. 80% of Iran's population, I believe, is under the age of 21. So there's a lot of momentum and movement there. And so, just to wrap up in our last remaining minute, what should the US be doing to take action on this, and what should the US not be doing?
So I think for one thing, the US should not be co-opted into the messaging that may be coming from diaspora groups. We have some pretty insidious groups like the MEK, who are reviled in Iran as well. And so be careful about anyone trying to co-opt it from outside, anyone. This is from the inside. We have to be listening and heeding the voices from people inside the country. There is a lot of talk around trying to open and provide channels of communication, both to the outside world, but also inside the country. People, with the economic situation as it's been, people use Instagram and other online apps for sales and things like that. So providing that kind of openness for people to communicate with each other internally and externally, I think is very important. In terms of money and so forth, one of the issues that we have is that the banking sanctions are such blanket sanctions. We can't even send money to our relatives, right? So if there's some way of enabling people to be able to transfer private funds for private use and so forth, that would be probably something that would be helpful. And then, frankly, I think that this is a moment to watch and make sure that we are showing solidarity with the students and the young women and so forth. And if they need asylum, if we get to a point where people need to leave, we need to give them a quick pathway out. Sharif University has students coming as graduate students to MIT and Caltech and so forth. So those kids, if we end up in a situation where they need to leave, they need to have a pathway out. But at this point, to try and make sure that it's nonviolent. And then one last thing, this is not the time to sign the JCPOA. That would give the regime, because it doesn't have legitimacy internally right now, is challenged, is going to look outward for legitimacy. And we shouldn't, the US shouldn't make that easier for them. Wait and see what's happening. And it's already been so long since the JCPOA was abandoned that another week, a month, and so forth, I don't think is going to make that much of a difference. So don't let them kind of use that to garner legitimacy outside.
The Biden administration has, in particular, talked about the importance of the rights of women and girls in the US, but also around the world. So this is certainly a moment of reckoning and a moment where we can see if the US and the current administration will put its money where its mouth is when it comes to issues like that.
Yeah, and I tell you one thing, if you look at the kids that are protesting, young women, their grandfathers may not have supported their grandmothers who were out on the streets, thought there wasn't a big issue, the hijab, and their fathers, what do you mean, my generation, would have probably didn't necessarily support, but were saying things like, we understand we don't like the hijab, but don't get yourself into trouble. Their brothers, their own generation now, standing side by side and protecting and being out there, and the women are leading. It's the girls that are leading. So the slogan of women, life, and freedom is really, really profound, and it's critical that the entire world is watching. And anybody who talks about feminist foreign policy or supporting women, this is transformative, what's happening there. And the solidarity between Iranian women and Afghan women, who are also fighting a big fight, is absolutely critical. They are at the front lines, and the courage is extraordinary. So it's very humbling to watch it.
Thank you, Sanam, so much for your time. Thank you for coming on Gendering Geopolitics, and thank you for your continuing work and voice on this issue.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me.